The Douglas Coleman Show is made possible with support from Seth David Radwell, a recent guest on the program and author of American Schism, How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nation, released this past July. As Publishers Weekly writes in its recent glowing book life review of American Schism, business executive Radwell's epic debut examines the historical influences that have led to what he sees as the collapse of politics in the United States. Seth Radwell makes the case that the current chasm between the American right and left can be traced back to the 18th century's Age of Enlightenment and the basic tenets of liberty, equality, and reason. American Schism provides a historical perspective that can help us fight today's unreason with reason and bridge current-day divides. American Schism by Seth David Radwell is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and wherever books are sold. For more information, go to AmericanSchismBook.com.
It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Hi, this is Marilyn Kirby, and you're listening to me on the Douglas Coleman Show. Here's my new single, Little Black Suitcase.
Down by the railway station, I'm waiting on a train. I got my whole like little black suitcase sitting in the rain. Getting out of this stinking town, I won't be back again. You can count on a train, show up on time, get me round the bend. Oh, you can count on it. I'm still waiting on that train. I got my whole life in a little black suitcase, sitting in the rain. You can count on your suitcase, you can count on your guitar, and you can count on a train to show up on time. Get me out of here. Oh, you can count on it, count on it, count on it, count on it. You can count on it. You can count on it. You can count on it. Count on it.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Marilyn Kirby. Hey, Marilyn, how are you?
Hi, how are you? I'm fine.
Doing great, thank you. Thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
You and I kind of have a similar background, and you grew up in the Boston area, yeah?
I did. Grew up in Newton,
Okay.
Massachusetts.
But neither of us live there anymore. It's funny, New England is a place where a lot of people come from, but a lot of people have moved away. It's amazing the people I've met that, oh yeah, I'm from there, and then they don't live there anymore. I think it's the winter that kills people. They just want to get out of there.
Yeah, well, I live in Woodstock, New York now, and the winters aren't any better here.
Oh, well, it's probably worse there, yeah?
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah. I got a kick out of the 13-year-old Marilyn getting her first guitar with green stamps. Now, you got to be old enough to remember green stamps. But,
Right?
yeah, do you remember how many green stamps it took to get a guitar?
How many books? They came in you
Books.
carefully pasted. You go to the AMP, and you get the stamps for how much money you spent, and then you paste them in the books. I don't know. It was a bunch of books, but I can't remember. It was a K guitar, and
I don't even remember K guitars. Were they any good?
well, K, they made all kinds of guitars, and they made really cheap, cheesy ones that you could get at the S&H green stamps, but they also made a couple of guitars that have been recognized. They made a thing, isn't the K, was the K that had the Patrician, was that a K or was that a Harmony? I don't know. They were pretty much a guitars for the people kind of thing, nothing like what Fender was doing or Gibson, or even Harmony had some quality, better guitars than that. But anyway, it was a starter guitar, and I learned 2 chords. I learned to play A minor and E minor, and began a phase of music which I call my dirge period, or my mother called it my dirge period. But I've learned more chords and play a much happier bunch of songs than I used to.
Well, it's even similar to an interview I heard with Paul McCartney when he said, when John and I first got together, we knew A, D, and E, and we were working on B7. And I always thought that was a funny line.
Advanced.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. B7 was. I don't think Buddy Holly even used B7, did he?
Oh, I don't know. Probably not. Buddy Holly probably didn't use a 7. I'm sure he did, but
most of his songs were sort of A, D, and E.
Yeah, well, 3 chords and the truth, honey.
Yeah.
That's the description of country music, and it can also be said pretty much for certainly early rock and roll and even present song. Basic songs are in the rock and pop genre aren't that complicated. They don't have diminished and I mean, except the Beatles. The Beatles introduced all of those kind of chords, augmenteds, and unusual changes to the popular vocabulary. And they really switched things up. Music got a lot more interesting after that.
Yeah, it sure did. And also Brian Wilson. I have to give him credit, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Brian Wilson is definitely one of my my heroes and villains.
He was doing all kinds of strange stuff on Pet Sounds. And
Pet Sounds is an amazing album.
Yeah. I never get tired of it. So your bio says you moved to New York City in 1968. Okay, so you were a little bit ahead of me. I moved there from Boston in 1980, but was doing the same thing. I've been a lifelong musician, although I'm not currently active in the music scene other than I've got a few songs up on Spotify and iTunes, mostly working studio now. But the scene was probably a lot better in 1968 than it was in 1980, yeah?
Well, when I first moved, I was in a band in Boston. Just back up a little. I was in a band in Boston that was doing pretty well. There weren't a lot of bands back then. That was the new thing. People were putting bands together, and you could kind of get a deal. And I was around the time of Ultimate Spinach and Cloud, and the band I was in was called Catharsis. So we were doing pretty well, and then I kind of lost my voice for a while, and I had a boyfriend, and so I moved to New York. And when I was in New York, I was approached by a band called the Apple Pie Motherhood Band.
I've heard of them.
And they'd made a couple of albums, and they were recording on Atlantic, so I started working with them, and we sort of had a bizarre falling out of sorts. The guitar player was weird, and the guy my boyfriend at the time, who later became my husband, didn't want me to do that. You know, guys don't want their girls playing rock and roll. They want them home making supper and washing the socks, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, you laugh. You know, that's how it was.
That's how it was.
So I got a resistance from him, and eventually I left the band. And it was a drag. And then there was another band. But I recorded on Atlantic. And my backup, they released the album, but they took out all my lead vocals. And so since the guy, my husband at the time, did not want me to do this stuff, I really didn't play. I started playing folk music. I went back to folk music and playing guitar and singing pretty songs and things like that. And that went on until I started wanting to play rock and roll again. I really wanted to play rock. And there was, I had friends in the music scene and stuff, and so I put together a band and started playing, and that pretty much ended my marriage, because that wasn't, so for me it was music, then marriage, then music again, and the music, they weren't really positive. And then after I did music for a while, I had a great band in the late 70s, early 80s, and I made this video that you can see on YouTube, Marilyn Kirby and some guys, and the song is called Is It True Blondes Have More Fun? And that was probably around 82 I made that video, and was playing around the city like I said, for quite a while, and had a good time, and then I fell in love and got married and had a kid. And that ended everything. So I didn't play music for another 20 years. I probably didn't play at all.
Wow.
And then I realized I have to play music. This is ridiculous. This is what I really, really love to do. And so that ended that marriage. Once I started playing again, that ended that. So it's not really the answer to the question you asked.
It's all right. It's an interesting story.
But it's weird. And now I'm with somebody who's very supportive of my music, and it's not a choice. I don't have to make a choice anymore.
I think that's.
And it turns out my son is a musician. He's in a punk band in New York City.
Oh, great.
Called Funeral Leech, and it's good, and I'm really enjoying playing a lot in Woodstock. I have a great band, the band that's on the album. and I'm enjoying, my senior years.
Let me ask you. You said that you recorded at Atlantic. Did you were there at the time of Ahmet Erdogan? Yeah. Did you meet him?
I did not. I never met him, and I'm sorry about that. It was a huge, big studio in Columbus Circle. It's not there anymore. They tore it down, and the building it was in, and put up, I think the Javits Center or something. Anyway, it's not there anymore. And we used to rehearse in a space that had Sundays Will Never Be, Spanky and Our Gang. I had to sing the song before I could think of their name. Spanky and Our Gang were rehearsing. We shared a rehearsal space with them. And probably some other band that may have come in the morning, and we never did anything in the morning, so I never met them. But it was, it was an interesting period of time.
So you've seen the entire spectrum of the music industry, from the traditional days to what it's turned into now with the internet and digital. What do you think's better? Do you think it was better then, better now, or just...
I'm not particularly good at navigating the internet and there's a whole way to connect to the universe now that, you'd put out an album then and it would be word of mouth, and it would get, if you got air, and you could send things out to DJs who were a lot more open, and they didn't have to speak to the head of the program director at a station. Program directors are very important, and they pick out the set list and they do all that. And that was the original form of promotion, really. Now the internet is the way of promotion. Back in the day, you could pay a DJ and he'd start it, and you could get locally and then get picked up, and it would move along. And, a totally silly side story about program directors is that at one time, back in, let me see, what year are we talking about? 57, 58. At that time, my father worked at WBZ in Boston. WBZ Radio.
Yeah.
And he was actually a program director and worked with people like Carl DeSuze. If you remember them, I'll be surprised, because I think I'm pretty sure I'm older than you. And my father, people would submit records. They would get tons of records thrown at them, these 45s. And my father would bring home all the ones that didn't make the playlist, and stuff from my older brother, who was probably 11 at the time, to play disc jockey. And he would go through the records, and he'd pick out Pat Boone, a white sports coat and a pink carnation.
I remember that song.
I'm all dressed up for the dance, And the ones he didn't like, he'd throw out. Well, I went through the pile he threw out, and what was in there? There were chess records, Checkers, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, Little Walter. I was 8 years old, and I put these records on my little toy 45 record player, and I listened to that stuff. I'm 8 years old, and he's singing, I want to get close to you, baby, like a white on rice. I want to get close to you, baby, like sweet is tonight. It's like, what? What is this man singing about? Or she's 19 years old and she's got ways like a sweet baby child. What are these guys talking about? And I was probably ruined right about then. Because I'd heard this music and I thought, that was the blues. And so when I became a teenager, the reason I told you this story is because my father was a program director, and they just threw out all this stuff that wasn't going to get played on BZ. And nowadays, the station manager, program director, it used to be you could send a record to a DJ and maybe it would get played. Now, I got a radio publicist. I have this wonderful album. Let me promote my album here. Year of the Phoenix. I'm very proud of this album. So I get a radio publicist, and we're trying to send it around the world and stuff. But even stations where, around here where I'm known and I get good, I have a following and people come to my shows. The local stations, it's just not, I think it's because I just don't have enough of a machine. I don't have a lot of people behind me. The machine is very, very important. It's still very, very important. You can make it on your own if you have a super savvy of the internet, if you're an influencer or something.
Yeah.
But the machine is still it. It's still the driving force. And here's another story. When I made a video with my band in 1982, 83, and of this song, Is It True Blondes Have More Fun? It's a silly, fun video. And it was at the beginning days of MTV. MTV was doing a segment called Basement Tapes, and they invited everybody, submit us your band. We want to see homemade basement tapes. So I went out and made this video. I did it myself. I did all the pre-production. I had a friend who did all the post-production and basically directed the video. And he was working for Walter Cronkite's Universe on CBS, and he had access to CBS editing room because that's what he did. He won an Emmy for editing Walter Cronkite's Universe. So here I had these really great people. A cameraman, he'd just come back from, I don't know, where would you come back from in 82? He was like a war correspondent. He was a good cameraman.
Afghanistan, probably.
And stuff. We made this great video. So I take it into MTV, and I'm really proud. And I'm submitting this to the Basement Tapes. I'm there in the office, and she says, here's the form. So I take the form and look at the form, and I thought the form would say, who's the artist? Who wrote the song? Who's the blah, blah, blah. No, it was who directed it, who produced it, who is the manager, who is the agent, who is the this, who is the that. So I just wrote my name in every single one of the spaces and submitted it. And it was returned to me unopened, unseen, I'm pretty sure. No answer why, and in talking to people, I realized it was because I had no machine. I didn't have an agent. I didn't have a manager. I didn't have someone else running this show. You can see this video, which I'm very proud of. I think it's hysterical, and it's kind of a cult classic. Is It True Blondes Have More Fun? And I'm in drag. It's on, and by Marilyn Kirby and some guys on YouTube. And anyway, that's where you can see it. And the guys are all in drag. I'm in drag. I play 5 different characters in the beauty salon. We found a beauty salon called Marilyn's Beauty Salon on 207th Street and Broadway. And, it's hysterical. But it's never went anywhere because there was no machine behind it. So the importance of the machine cannot be ignored.
Well, how does one?
And that's one of my problems. I'm terrible at self-promotion. I can't promote myself out the front door,
Well, how does one create a machine? These days, it's all about networking on internet.
Attention, Well, you finished. These days.
No, I said.
Started to say.
I said these days. How does one create a machine? I think these days it's all done on the internet. You create a network, and you start knocking on doors electronically.
Right.
I mean, I think that's how it's done.
Yeah, and you hire a publicist. You hire somebody who knows how to do that.
Yeah.
And that's where it's funny that I've tried to find people who, promoters, publicists, or manager even. The word manager is really more of a publicist, and then you have an agent who books you. They're really, I don't know what the manager is exactly, unless they tell you what. I don't know. So I have never, and in the past 10 years, I started playing again about 10 years ago, and I've just been plugging away at it. And I write songs, and I sing, I do gigs. So, but it's something, I don't know if it's because I just missed, I'm too old to figure it out, or I'm too old-fashioned to figure it out. I don't know. But you're absolutely right. And that's why I hired a radio publicist. But again, if it's not attached to anything, I got a lot of airplay I got a fair amount in Europe, some in Canada. A couple of podcasts in Canada play me fairly regularly. And I was on, the best airplay that I know of was on FUV, which is WFUV, which is a pretty big indie station in the New York area. And they have a podcast, or an Sunday afternoon show called Woody's Children. And they played one of the songs from the album on that. And that was really nice. But regular airplay, you know, I think a lot of it is videos, too. You really need to have a video attached to the song.
Oh, yeah.
That's helpful.
Yeah, well, ever since MTV. That changed forever in the early 80s. Because before, in the 70s, nobody cared what you looked like. In fact, if you look at a lot of the great bands from the 70s, they were pretty ugly. You know, they didn't care. Gnarly looking, you know. Look at Steely Dan. Oh, my God. You know, but their music was fantastic, and nobody cared what they looked like. When I saw them first time on the Midnight Special, it was the first time I ever saw them, you know, except for a very slick-looking album cover. And I thought, oh, wow, these guys are just ugly-looking. But nobody cared because the music was so good.
Well, you didn't have someone who made you look, you know.
Yeah, but then...
I'm trying to think what the word... someone who makes you look good.
Well, a makeup artist or a plastic surgeon.
Right.
But once...
beautician, or maybe...
A beautician,
God
yeah.
To revive.
But once MTV came along, that all changed. And you look at the way that the bands went from that sort of grungy 70s look to the big hair and the tight pants and all of that from the 80s.
Yep.
The look completely changed. But personally for me, I thought the music went downhill because the music took a back seat to the look. It wasn't about what you sounded like. It's about what you looked like. And it totally changed.
Yeah, it became much more important what you look like, which doesn't favor, shall we say, older artists either.
No.
But then you have to go on being funny. You have to either be funny, you know, I guess you have to have a gimmick. You know, like Gypsy Rose Lee would tell you, you got to have a gimmick. You got to have shtick. So
yeah.
You really do. You have to have some kind of shtick that will keep people happy. And you know, the thing about the video, you know, one of the things that I'll still never understand why that video didn't get into the MTV thing. And I mean, I understand because there was no machine and everything, but the video was hysterical. I'm really very proud of it, and it was not just all the bands that wound up getting into the basement tape thing. A lot of them were just these little showcases, something at SIR where the band was standing there. And they were all a bunch of shoegazers. You know what I mean by shoegazers? People who play guitar with their head down, looking at their shoes.
Looking at their feet.
And you never see the face of people, you just see the tops of their heads.
Yeah.
And they don't even look at the audience, they don't relate to the audience. They're just playing, or they might have a fancy lead singer who's kind of singing out front, but everything behind them is just guys standing playing songs in front of a curtain. Those were the videos that got through. And mine had a whole storyboard, a whole thing going on. You know, I chased myself down an alley. I walk into a beauty salon, and I'm a man on TV talking about blondes. I thought, you know, and that disillusioned me so bad that, you know, it wasn't about content. It was about the machine.
Well, and it was about flavor of the week, and maybe you didn't quite catch it at the right time.
Maybe not.
You know, luck is a lot of that. Timing. Marilyn, we do have to wrap this up. Unfortunately, we have run out of time.
And or just Marilyn Kirby. You can find me on YouTube. You can find me on Bandcamp. Most of my music is available on Bandcamp, Marilyn Kirby. And, you can. That's where you can find me.
Okay, great.
And my album, You're the Phoenix, and the single is Little Black Suitcase. And you can look for them, and they'll be there.
Okay.
You're listening to Mr. Smooth and Savvy right here on the Douglas Coleman Show. We'll be right back after these commercial messages.
Douglas Coleman's Don't Do a Podcast is a dryly humorous rant about Douglas's pet peeve, the unrelenting torrent of podcasts hitting the web on a constant basis. As technology has put podcasting within the reach of anyone, many wholly unqualified people have taken the plunge. This witty polemic tries to persuade them from broadcasting their drivel using Douglas's brand of sarcastic humor. Now on Amazon, only 99 cents.
DJC Music and DJC Productions are pleased to announce a brand new website. We have started a listing website for radio show hosts as well as potential show guests. This is a meeting site where hosts and guests can come together. Show hosts can list their show and types of guests they're interested in booking. Potential guests can list their talents, bio, accomplishments, or anything they feel makes them an interesting radio show guest. There are no recurrent payments, only a one-time $5 listing fee. Your listing will stay up until you decide to cancel. Previous guests of The Douglas Coleman Show are welcome to submit their guest listing free of charge. Go to radiohostsandguests.com. That's radiohostsandguests.com.
Are you an independent musician? How would you like to have your songs played on hundreds of radio stations just like the one you're listening to right now? Join MusicSubmit.com and we'll promote your music to radio stations and blogs in your genre. It's free to set up your account, and we guarantee your music will be considered for airplay by radio stations worldwide. Why not sign up today? It's free. MusicSubmit.com. Radio promotion for indie musicians.
Hey, this is Ray Powers. Don't touch anything. You've got it right where you need it. Tuned in to The Douglas Coleman Show. You heard me.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Mark Henick. Hey, Mark, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on this show. I appreciate it. So, what do you call yourself? Speaker? Author?
I call myself a lot of things,
Yeah.
but usually I try to call myself a mental health advocate. That's what I'm most passionate about is, sharing my own story, but really allowing others to share their stories of their mental health as well.
Okay. Well, you've got a book out called So-Called Normal. And how long has the book been out?
Came out in January, and actually it was just a year yesterday. I got one of those Facebook reminders when I first received the galley, the first physical version of it. And I'd been working on this for 4 years up until that point. So it's pretty amazing now to look back over the last few months and see how well it's been received.
Okay. Is this your first book?
It is, yeah, my first ever. And, I was the type of person who never thought I would ever, really accomplish anything, but especially write a book. It was one of those bucket list things for me. So now that it's out there, it's just been such a wild ride to share my story in such raw detail.
Was this a COVID baby in the sense that...
Yeah, well, it wasn't. I was working on it long before that, but it was certainly COVID that really pushed it over the finish line, because we were in that... we were editing for ages, it seemed like, and I just couldn't let it go. But then COVID came, of course, and I had to let it go real quick.
I've had so many authors come on the show over the last 18 months because during the, last year when a lot of people were in lockdown, all of a sudden they had all this time on their hands. So they finished that book they'd been meaning to write for the last 15 years. And we just got inundated with authors with books. So that's why I was wondering if this was something that maybe you had been working on or was started or wanted to work on, and then COVID allowed you the time to do so.
Yeah, no, I think what COVID did for me, I wrote about this for CNBC and then a follow-up piece for USA Today as well. Since most of my business, my media consulting business has been in public speaking and in events and things of that nature. When COVID hit, I suddenly lost a lot of the work that I had booked out for the next year. So I realized pretty quickly, within about 3 days, I had a year's worth of work just pulled out from under me. So I said, okay, it doesn't matter if I don't think the book is is quite done yet. It was. We'd already been through, I think, 14 full edits. It was more than done. But I didn't feel that way. And I think I was just scared. So when the rug got ripped out from under me because of COVID, I said, okay, we have to get this out there because I've got to pivot real quick. And that's really what my story is about in many ways, too. That's what resilience is how do you pivot? How do you get back up when you fall? And that's what I hope that people take away from my book.
So this book is a bit of a memoir in the sense, is your life story?
It is very much so, and I spend much of it focusing on. I guess the touch point for it was really the TED Talk that I did back in 2013, which ends up going viral around the world. It got millions of views. It ended up becoming one of the most watched TEDx talks ever. And it was I tell two stories of my first suicide attempt, and then what ended up being my last suicide attempt. That became so popular so quickly. I had so many people talking to me and asking me for help and sharing their stories with me. I really felt that it was necessary to go back and tell, the story of what got me to such a dark place, that you don't just become suicidal out of nowhere, contrary to popular belief, I think. So that's really what I try to do in the book, is to tell, the story of how I got to such a dark place in my life, but then, more importantly, I think, how I recovered, how I got better.
Okay, well, mental health is a big topic, and I don't know if we have that much time to really unpack the whole thing. I mean, you can look at it historically from some of those butcher shop type mental institutions where they were performing lobotomies and electroshock therapy. I think we've come a long way from that. But I think there's still a lot of ground that is unfamiliar to people about what exactly constitutes mental health issues. Everybody gets sad, everybody gets angry, everybody is happy. But it's when it's to one extreme or another that people become concerned, and doctors put you on medication if you get depressed to the point where you can't pull yourself up. I don't know. How do you feel about the medication? Because I know a lot of people who are on antidepressants, and I think it helps, but it also is a little bit fearful for me, because those people, if they stop taking their medication, they tend to be worse than they were when they started.
Well, I mean, I think it depends. There's a lot of stigma around medication. And look, the way that I look at it is that if you have a brain, then you have mental health. And I mean, if you've ever been to Washington, I'm not entirely convinced that everybody has a brain, but I think that we have to. Yeah. We have decades and decades of research to recognize the neurological correlates of mental health. However, I think that if we stop there and say, as many people do, in fact, that when they're trying to reduce stigma by saying that mental health conditions are brain disorders, I think that's actually too hardline of an approach. And I don't actually think it's very helpful, because while yes, the brain is necessary for the mind and for mental health, it's not sufficient. We also know that how we think, our patterns and our habits of thinking is just as, if not more important than how your brain works, in fact. And then on top of that, too, your environment and how your society works, what your upbringing is like, those social factors are key determinants of our mental health as well. So, medication eventually worked for me. It was a long, hard road to get there. I went through a dozen or more different medications, cocktails of medications. Some of the medications themselves, it was the medication that made me a lot worse. It wasn't coming off of it or anything like that. It was the medication itself. But I eventually did find one that helped me. And then I eventually, many years later, was able to come off of it quite successfully. So I think that there are many routes to recovery. Medication might be necessary for you. You can't go to therapy if you're so depressed you can't get out of bed in the morning. So it might be that assist that you need. But I think if you're expecting the medication to do the work for you, to make you recover and make you better, I've never seen that happen. So I think it has to be a combination effort. And for some people, a medication is a key part of that.
So one size doesn't fit all, basically.
I think, one size doesn't fit all. And I think you have to really look at where your depression, in my case, is coming from, or whatever the mental illness is. Some mental illnesses are much more biological than others. If you're dealing with something like schizophrenia, for example, or bipolar disorder, still very treatable conditions, of course, but they are more biologically oriented. So that's where you would want to focus more of your attention. So I think you really have to do the work of understanding where your struggle is actually coming from, what barriers it's putting up in your life, and then tackling it that way, rather than just assuming that you can just take this one medication that you saw on TV and that'll make you happy. That I've seen it, I've experienced it as a person, who has gone through this stuff, but I've seen it as a clinician as well. That approach rarely works because you need to be involved in your own recovery.
So what happened to you in the sense that, was this a chemical or was it environmental?
Yes. I think
all of the above.
It was certainly all of those factors. For me, I think I probably had a genetic predisposition anyway. I certainly have a family history, as many people do, of depression and anxiety. So that was a factor. I never learned from a very young age how to actually identify my emotions, how to process them. I grew up with a stepfather who just surrounded us in this toxic masculinity that even as a little boy, I had to be a man. I had to suck it up. I wasn't allowed to feel my feelings. Certainly wasn't allowed to cry or express my feelings or talk about, things that made other people uncomfortable. And it turns out if you don't express that stuff, if you don't process it, it doesn't go away. It just comes out in other ways. And for me, it came out as suicidality. And then, being in a community that didn't have many resources. I grew up in a small town on the East Coast, an industrial town with high unemployment and just an unwillingness in general to talk about emotion. So that, I think, compounded it too. So I think it's all three of those factors. I had a vulnerability anyway. I didn't have the psychological skills, the mental skills to deal with it yet. And I didn't live in a community, in an environment that was really conducive to recovery.
Did you move away as soon as you could?
As soon as I could, I sure did.
Yeah.
And, it was actually, I spent, before I left for college, after high school, I took a summer away, and I didn't realize that this was so important for me until I wrote the book. I took a summer away to study in Quebec. I left for, I think, 8 weeks it was. Lived in somebody else's house with like a host family and all that stuff. And then when I came back, I much later realized that was a really important first step for me to see that, maybe I could make it outside of this little hometown, and maybe I could make it on my own. Maybe I could do things that are outside of what everybody expects me to do, which is basically that you maybe graduate high school, then you get a job at the plant or at the, seeing that I could have a different life. I think that was an early seed to show me that maybe I could do something else. So I ended up leaving for college, mostly to try to study ways to understand myself, and it ended up turning into a career and a wonderful life.
Well, that's kind of interesting. Did you have anything in mind when you went to college initially, other than just to get away from the family?
I mean, that was a primary motivator, but I was going to study criminology, in part because, I saw CSI and Law and Order, and I just thought it was really cool. And then I took one introductory first-year criminology course, and I didn't want to do that anymore. But that's really when I first discovered psychology. And then as I delved deeper into psychology as a profession, I started to explore philosophy as well. And really that's where I found, in the marriage of those two disciplines, psychology and philosophy, that's where my passion really was. And, I learned from, those early stages too, that I never will fit neatly into one box, that I'm an interdisciplinary person by nature, that I like to think across boundaries and outside of boxes. So, that's really what I've been trying to do ever since, is to try to ask big questions and understand how I and other people think about them.
So how did you get started doing your speaking tours?
That started and I think it was another key part of my recovery, actually. I was discharged from that last hospitalization. I had been saved. My life was saved by a complete stranger on that last suicide attempt. And I didn't realize it at the time. I wasn't, it's not like it was a sudden reversal. But he stuck in my mind as somebody who didn't have to be there, but who reached out and saved me and helped me. And he became my role model, even though I never knew who he was, really. We only spent a brief time together when he physically pulled me off of the edge of a bridge and saved my life. but he stuck in my mind as somebody that I wanted to be like for the rest of my life. So that's when I went to my high school principal a few months after that incident and asked if I could speak openly about my experiences, if I could do a talk to my peers, because I knew other people were struggling with this stuff too. And of course, the principal said no, said that you can't do that. You can't talk about suicide in particular because it gives people the idea to do it as though they had never thought of it before. That's not true, by the way. Talking about suicide doesn't cause suicide. In fact, it's a protective factor. That's how we prevent suicide, is by talking openly about it. But we didn't know that at the time, of course, and he certainly didn't. So instead, I went home when they wouldn't let me speak. I went home and wrote my first ever editorial to the local newspaper. It was published the next morning, and then there were television news cameras in the principal's office asking why we couldn't talk about suicide and mental health in high school. So that's when it all started for me, because suddenly my story was out there in my little hometown. Everybody knew because everybody read the newspaper and everybody watched the evening news. Suddenly everybody knew, and there was no hiding anymore. And I think that's really where it started, because the response was that people were much more welcoming than I was expecting. They wanted to share their stories too, and they were just waiting for somebody to ask. So I think that's really where it started, was with that very first newspaper article and that very first television interview. And since then, I've done hundreds and hundreds all over the world, and the response has always been the same.
Well, that's great. So what was it that happened prior to you standing on the edge of a bridge?
I had been spiraling by that point for about 3 years. What started as a very kind of ill-defined, amorphous, just wet blanket of sadness and depression over me, started to articulate itself as what's called suicidal ideation. It's when you start to fixate on it, think about it a lot. Some people write about it or tell jokes about it, or it just preoccupies your mind. And then it starts to turn into something else, right? It comes out of your head. And for me, I was first discovered to be drawing little pictures about ways that I could end my life. And that started what ended up being more than a half a dozen different hospitalizations, because I would start to express it in this very kind of vague way. I'd be brought to hospital. They wouldn't really help me. They would keep me for a few days or sometimes a few weeks, but then discharged back out into the same situation without any real meaningful skills, new skills to help me get out of this place for good. And I would feel okay for a little while, but then, some crisis would happen, some fight at home, bullies at school, some stressor would happen, and I'd spiral again and go back to hospital again. And each time was increasingly more dangerous than the last. So it was almost like I was figuring out over the course of 3 years how to kill myself, taking a step closer each time, until eventually, by the time I got to that bridge about 3 years later, I had attempted a number of times. I'd been in and out of hospital. And I think what was different that time was that I felt hopeless. Like all these people, all these smart people, these experts couldn't help me. So maybe it meant that I was unhelpable. I was just one of those unfortunate few. So that's really what brought me to that place. The triggers, I'd come to think of them as trivial. The triggers didn't even really matter anymore. The problem was how my mind grabbed onto and spun with everything, that I had almost become, I think, addicted to suicide. It was the only way out, I thought. And if it wasn't for that stranger who interrupted me, really quite literally, that night, and shifted my perspective in such a profound way, I was certainly prepared to die that night.
So it wasn't a sympathy plea. I mean, I know people have, threatened suicide when they have people in their lives that they consider to be toxic or difficult to deal with, and people who dominate them and people who sort of make them feel bad, and they'll threaten suicide. But this wasn't for that. This was internally in your own head, right? It wasn't necessarily, I'm going to get back at them for being mean to me or something like that, right?
No, and those are largely myths anyway. These are pop culture myths that really took the spotlight around the time that that 13 Reasons Why series came up on Netflix, this particular discussion of the revenge suicide. The research shows that that's not really a very common occurrence at all. It does happen, sure, like anything else, but it's quite rare. And likewise, when people say that, and this is one of the most common things I hear, in fact, that people who are suicidal or self-harming are just looking for attention. They're just attention seeking, as though our attention, your attention, was the most valuable resource on earth, that you can't possibly spare it for a few minutes just to keep somebody alive. So that on its own has a bit of an issue. But also I push back against the overall conception that if somebody is that desperate for connection, they are connection seeking, how crushingly lonely they must feel, whether it's caused by their mind or their environment or whatever. If they are feeling that isolated, that hopeless and helpless, if their brain is doing that to them, among other factors, then we need to intervene in a way that helps them to build connection, to feel connection, because that's what depression does to you, right? Depression builds up this brick wall around your mind so that you just suffocate inside that enclosed space. And that was one of, I think, the concepts from my TED Talk that caught on the most, was this idea of a perceptual collapse, that your mind collapses in on yourself. It's like you're just in a dark cave, and you feel like it's your only way out to end your life. And it often doesn't even matter if you have other options, because you can't see them. So you think it's your only option.
Well, that's really interesting. You know, I went through one short period where I was put on medication, and after, these were the kind that you have to build up the levels in your body. Like, one pill doesn't do anything. You have to take it over a period of weeks. And what I found for me was that although it leveled out the depression, it completely destroyed my creative abilities. Because I'm a musician, I'm a songwriter, I do this show, and I couldn't do it. I had zero. That creative side, the right brain side, it just shut it down. And I said, this is awful. I can't even write a song. So I stopped taking them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and it's not, I identify with this as a creative person myself, primarily as a writer and thinker, that so much of our creativity comes from the friction inside us. I think the problem is that sometimes that friction can become overwhelming and it burns you to the ground. Sometimes you feel like you can't channel it in an effective way. It's not a coincidence that so many musicians and artists and comedians and others die by suicide. Because that muse, that energy or eros or whatever you want to call it,
right.
It can carry you away. So, that is a trade-off in a way, and I think that's something that creative types need to keep in mind. Is this art that I'm creating right now, or am I just suffering? And you have to make a choice at some point. If you can carry that burden, being happy, being healthy isn't all about, or I should say being healthy isn't all about being happy all the time. But you don't have to be a martyr either. You're not going to torture and crucify yourself on the altar of your art. At least I hope not. So I think that is a decision that all of us need to be aware of and mindful of, and find a middle ground as well. There are many routes to recovery. If medication isn't right for you, medication isn't right for a lot of people. That's okay. I'd suggest that you try it to see if it is right for you. Don't just deny it outright. But if it's not, that's okay. You're not alone. There are many other routes to recovery. We know that psychotherapy, evidence-based psychotherapy, works better than medication for the vast majority of common mental health problems. So there are other routes, that you're never out of options.
Well, we do have to wrap this up. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Do you have a website that you want to give out?
Yeah, my website is markhenick.com. That's Mark, MarkHenick.com. I'm also on most social media platforms at the same name. And my book is available everywhere, Amazon, but also Barnes & Noble and most other book retailers.
Well, thanks so much. I know we could have gone on. Mental health is a huge topic. We could have talked for days about this. But I think we gave people a good overview and gave them a good teaser for your book. Best of luck with the book. I hope it does well.
Thank you very much.
To the